speaker is Rowan Pruitt. Her faculty mentor is Dr. Rachel Neal. So please welcome Rowan.
Hi, my name is Rowan Pruitt, and I did my honors thesis research on college students' consent and sexual scripts. I primarily became interested in researching consent after becoming involved in the on-campus student advocacy organization, It's On Us. It's On Us is a national grassroots organization to raise awareness about sexual assault on college campuses. Sexual violence is inherently linked to the concept of consent via our legal understanding of sexual assault as sex with the absence of consent. This highlights consent education as a vital aspect of sexual violence prevention programs, including at It's On Us. Through my experience, I became very involved about how college students experience consent, as well as how they define it, as well as this overall general change in the understanding of consent. College students in many ways were a microcosm of this general change, especially as issues of sexual violence gained more public attention. I became interested in consent negotiation in relation to sexual scripts in order to make consent education more effective. In addition, previous literature focuses on the experience of heterosexual white women, limiting our understanding of how male students, queer students, and students of color negotiate their sexual agency. Sexual violence is a prevalent issue in our country, making consent education and research incredibly important. One out of 6 American women has experienced sexual assault in their lifetime. About 1 in 33 American men have experienced sexual assault in their lifetime. 9 out of 10 victims of sexual assault are women, though this is not a women-only issue. College campuses especially are at a relatively high risk of sexual assault victimization and perpetuation, and understanding sexual consent is imperative to reduce the incidence of sexual assault. Among college students, 23% of females and 5% of males experience sexual assault in their lifetime. Sexual assault prevention efforts have focused on educating students about obtaining consent, though little research has been done in how college students actually consent to sex. For the purpose of this study, consent can be understood as an individual's verbal or nonverbal expression of agreement to engage in sexual activity. Previous literature has found that college students engage in consent in both a direct and indirect nature. But mixed results were found with regards to whether college students tend to indicate consent more frequently as verbal or nonverbal behavior. And these dynamics provide a framework for this research project. Sexual script theory is the idea that there are culturally determined patterns of behavior that inform desire and influence sexual behavior. This concept is based on symbolic interactionism and social learning, that human beings behave based on social cues that they have witnessed others following. Sexual scripts guide behavior, individual interpretations of cultural norms, and individuals' constructions of their own desires. In fact, previous literature has found that during the internalization process of sexual scripts, individuals learn their role in the script, and in turn, individuals learn prescribed gender roles, and their associated behaviors largely influence how young men and women approach sex. In many ways, an individual's internalized sexual script informs their understanding of consent and when it should be practiced and how it should be practiced in order to maintain the situation. Each sexual encounter and engagement in consent negotiation is then internalized and an individual's sexual script is adjusted. These scripts are perpetuated in media, including popular magazines, film, television, pornography, and they are reaffirmed by our family and friends. Major sexual scripts that inform this research project include affirmative consent, women as gatekeepers, token resistance, and date rape scripts. Affirmative consent, or yes means yes, conceptualizes consent as an affirmative, unambiguous, conscious decision by each participant to engage in mutually agreed upon sexual activity. Women as gatekeepers, or no means no consent, reflects traditional sexual scripts that men are expected to initiate sex, women are expected to function as gatekeepers, deciding whether or not sex will actually occur. Token resistance refers to saying yes when you mean no, and the idea that this is just part of the traditional sexual script, the song and dance of getting your partner to agree, and that when women say no, they don't really mean it. Date rape scripts establish binary ideas of real rape and gray rape, or date rape. Real rape is an attack by a deranged stranger in the night, whereas date rape includes more psychological coercion, and psychological coercion is used more frequently than physical force. The differentiation between the two does not reflect actual incidences of sexual violence, and instead normalizes psychological coercion mechanisms and partner passivity in the traditional script. For my project, I conducted a mixed method analysis. At first, I approached a quantitative method both for practicality and privacy. This is a pretty sensitive subject, but without the qualitative element, I found that you wouldn't really understand students' definitions of consent for themselves. So a mixed approach was pretty critical for my analysis. Quantitative data included key demographics, how students understand and use consent, whereas qualitative data included formal and informal sexual education mechanisms, why students engage in consent, and more. Because of the relationship between sexual violence and college campuses, I felt it was imperative to study college students and their engagement of consent. I recruited college students from St. Edward's, the University of Texas at Austin, and Austin Community College. I wanted to recruit students from both liberal arts schools and state schools because just as the previous presenter mentioned, St. Edward's liberal arts schools, they have kind of a unique culture, and so I wanted to test both cultures so that my results could be generalizable. Key demographics I tested for include gender, race, sexual orientation, and relationship status. I'm extremely proud of my results. I got over 101 participants to participate, and the majority of which were 18 to 25. And this generally reflects the St. Edward's demographics of students, where 80% of the students are between 18 to 25. But I think this age range limited my study because it grouped a significant portion of my participants together, and there may have been more variance between 18 to 25 that I wasn't able to study for. With gender, 74% of my participants were women, 22 were men, and 4% identified as non-binary. These numbers sort of reflect the general population of St. Edward's, but I think it's more reflective of the idea that consent is women's business. There was a difference in response rates between men and women, and even in how much they completed the survey. Racial results showed 44% of my participants were white, 6% were black, 36% were Latinx, 3% were North African or Middle Eastern, 2% identified as Native American, 3% identified as South Asian, and 2% East Asian. In total, 52% of my participants were students of color. These results generally reflect the demographics of St. Edward's. There was enough responses for white and Latinx respondents to test general trends. There were not enough Asian and African American participants to study the effects on race for those individuals. Sexual orientation results were very interesting. Although 67% of my participants were straight, a third of respondents identified as not heterosexual in some way. And a significant portion of my survey identified as bisexual. Relationship statuses showed 52% were dating or in relationships, 40% single, 5% married and long-term relationships, and interestingly enough, multiple participants reported being in friends with benefits relationships. And all of this will affect how people practice consent and how comfortable they are practicing consent with their partner. As far as experience of sex education go, the majority of respondents reported receiving formal sex education in middle school and in high school, and the majority receives sex education in multiple levels of education. So middle school and high school, some all the way through, it just depends. In their sex ed classes, participants reported learning about sexual anatomy, pregnancy, abstinence, STIs, and the sexual anatomy of the opposite sex. Less likely to be reported was learning about birth control, healthy relationships, and abortion. While abstinence was still reported at a significant level, it wasn't the level I was expecting here in Texas. It seems sex education is still hyper-focused on pregnancy and STIs, and the discussion of healthy relationships is fairly minimal. One limitation to this question that I forgot to include is actual consent. Was consent included in basic sex education? I guess my personal sex education blurred me thinking about that. With regards to informal sex education, almost a third of participants reported being influenced by the internet. A quarter reported being influenced by their peers, and 24% reported being influenced by media. As far as which informal sex education mechanism had the most impact on their understanding of consent, there was definitely a generational element with regards to the internet. Respondents across race, gender, and sexual orientation reported a high influence of the internet. LGBTQ respondents were more likely than straight participants to report being influenced by the internet, which reflects the general heteronormative nature of traditional sex education. Out of all the participants that reported being influenced by family, most were women. Latinx participants reported the highest level of familial and media influences, whereas white respondents reported the highest level of peer influence. In addition, for LGBTQ respondents, personal experience had a significant impact on their understanding of consent. One participant that identifies as lesbian said, "There's so few resources available when it comes to lesbians for sex that she was just at a loss." Other important findings from participants were the influence of doctors and more academic sex education mechanisms such as books and therapy. One participant's definition of consent reads, "The meaning of consent to me means that both individuals willfully want to participate in an activity with one another and continue to want to continue that activity as it takes place. Consent needs to be clearly given before any activity takes place." This particular response contains many major themes reflected in my results, including mutual communication, consent as an affirmative agreement, and the idea that consent is an ongoing process. Additional aspects that this response hints at is the idea that consent needs to be easily understood. When the respondent reports it needs to be clearly given, this demonstrates that all participants should be fully aware of what is going to occur and what each other is comfortable with. This response also highlights consent as a gateway that partners have to cross in order to continue maintaining the sexual script. With relation to typical college students' sexual script, participants typically engaged in consent before and during sexual activity. Though respondents did report engaging in consent after, it was less common. As to why participants would engage in consent, respondents indicated consent is an important aspect of their typical sexual encounter, and that it should always be obtained. Participants continue to highlight consent as mutual communication that results from an informed decision so that participants can know what to expect. Additional reasons participants gave as to why they would want to engage in consent is fear of accusation, past experience, and respect. I found that participants across gender, race, and sexual orientation preferred to engage in direct consent, verbal or nonverbal. Participants reported more variance in their affirmative kinds of consent, and with regards to negative consent, Overwhelmingly, respondents prefer direct verbal consent. Overwhelmingly, respondents reported the importance of mutual pleasure, emotional connection, and consent within the sexual interaction. Mutual pleasure was the most common response across gender, race, and sexual orientation. This increased emphasis generally shows a decline in traditional masculinity and heteronormative scripts. My findings indicate more students conceptualize consent in an affirmative way, that yes means yes, than previous literature had found. Additionally, more students include consent within their typical sexual script and highlight the importance of consent within their sexual encounters. With self-reporting surveys, there is always the issue of imperfect data and participants not being fully honest about their responses. But throughout my survey, I found the importance of consent was indicated by participants almost at any chance they could. There was multiple fill-in features that people constantly filled with consent should always be obtained. All this shows that the focus on consent education and sexual violence prevention has a positive effect on the general sexual script, as more students report the importance of engaging in sexual consent negotiation. Additionally, education programs should discuss more nuanced interactions with consent, especially as romance and sexual interaction changes with technology. Consent engagement is an ongoing process and should adapt as people's engagement changes. It's a fun little flip of my references. I'd like to say thank you to the St. Edward's community for supporting me throughout this process, especially the sociology and photography departments. It's on us, Dr. Lisa Kirkpatrick, the Institutional Review Board, and all the on-campus organizations that helped distribute my survey. I'd especially like to thank my advisor, Dr. Neal. We've been working on this for about 2 years, so it's incredibly exciting. Thank you.
Time for a few questions.
What would you change with the survey of questions now that you have all those database?
So I would change the age range that I kind of previously mentioned. I would add a couple of features, a couple more responses into my survey. For instance, when people wrote, I was really influenced by books or doctors or therapy, those weren't things I included in my survey, and so maybe having a more broad understanding of how people obtain sexual education would be good. Additionally, I kind of minimized the aspect of respect versus several participants went out of their way to say, I participate in consent because of respect. So those are kind of two major things that I would add.
You've presented media as the driving factor in determining the general cultural script. Would you say that media representation is the most important aspect to change in our collective view of sex and consent to make a healthier culture?
It's incredibly important. I think unhealthy depictions of consent are just completely detrimental as they become internalized and as well as unchecked. If we don't say that this is a terrible representation, then people are just going to think it's normal. But I actually think it really happens at the most interpersonal level between your family and your friends. And it might mean engaging in more difficult conversations about sex and consent, but that's what's vital.
Would you address education about consent in communities that might be more traditional or different culturally? For example, the Western world has a different mentality than people where I'm from.
That would definitely be an interesting to study at like a much more international level of how does the West and the East and just in general our ideas, especially in the West, of individualism. Individualism has a detrimental effect on sex because sex is a partner experience, a mutual experience that we're all kind of engaging in. And the West's focus on individualism sometimes make it hard for people to care about their partner. But that my results do show that that's changing, but it would be interesting to see how that is reflected in more Eastern or communal cultures.
So one of your first statistics was that 1 in 6 women will be sexually assaulted.
Yes.
Is that 1 in 6 will report the sexual assault, or does that number, we hear different versions of that number?
So that is just the number of how many women are expected to experience sexual assault in their lifetime, not the actual number of people that report. Additionally, college students are particularly vulnerable to not reporting. They report at lower levels than people outside of college, as well as other communities that don't feel empowered to report, such as immigrants or people of color. So that does not reflect the amount of people reporting sexual assault. And I also think the sexual script of date rape shows that sometimes we won't even conceptualize what happens to us as sexual assault, even though it still occurred.
All right, thank you. Dr. Neal, do you have some words for your scholar?
I've known Rowan for, I guess it must be 4.5 years
Yeah.
now, which kind of sped by. As I was thinking about this, I was thinking about how I've seen Rowan both stay the same as well as change over the last 4 years. Every so often somebody asks me, what do you like about teaching? Or what do you like about teaching at St. Ed's? And honestly, what I usually say is something like, St. Ed's students are so interesting. They're so interested and also interesting. They go out and do all of these things. They volunteer, they travel, they participate in programs. And I don't think I've ever told you this, but honestly, your face is one of the ones that really pops into my mind whenever I say that. Because Rowan is that person. I don't know how many people know in the audience, but Rowan travels. Rowan takes advantage and finds her own programs when they aren't immediately available. Ever since I've known her, Rowan has had particular goals and dreams and has doggedly pursued them. Even this project, this was an incredibly complicated project. When she first came and talked to me about it, I was like, okay, yes. But when she said it took a couple of years, it literally took a couple of years. And to be honest, I think most students would have taken a look and thought about what was going to be required and said, oh, I'm going to choose a different topic. But Rowan made it happen. You know, she really worked at it. And I have so much confidence in you pursuing, you're going to be able to pursue your goals and to reach them. You really not to be cheesy about it, but this zest for life experiences. And I think that will continue after we graduate. And I can't wait to hear about everything you're doing because it's fascinating. And